We're going to continue looking at different ways to solve quadratic equations. In this presentation, we're going to discuss how to solve a quadratic equation by completing the square. So we're going to begin with an example, and I chose a very simple example just so that we can walk through the steps of how to complete the square. So our example is x squared plus 5x plus 4 is equal to 0. Step 1 in completing the square is to rearrange the terms so that the x terms are on the left side of the equation and the constant is on the right. So to do that, I'm going to take the positive 4 and I'm going to subtract it from both sides of the equation. So that's going to give me x squared plus 5x is equal to negative 4. Step 2 is to calculate half times the middle term and square it. Now, by the middle term, we mean the number that sits in front of the x, because remember that your quadratic equation has the form ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. So when we're talking about the middle term, we're talking about the number sitting in front of the x. So in our case, that is going to be 5. So I'm going to take 1/2 and I'm going to multiply it by 5 and I'm going to square the result. So remember that when you're multiplying fractions, you're going to multiply the top part of the fractions together and the denominator or the bottom part of the fractions together. So this 5 is over 1. And so when I multiply, I'm going to have 1 times 5 is 5, 2 times 1 is 2, and I need to square that, so I'm going to square the top and the bottom and get 25 over 4. So now I've calculated half of the middle term squared. The rest of step 2 tells me to add the result to both sides of the equation. So I'm going to come back up here to my equation, and in this space that I left, I'm going to add 25 over 4, and I'm going to add it to the other side as well. You have to add it to both sides because we want the equation to stay balanced. Step 3 says to factor the left side. So I'm going to factor this into 2 sets of parentheses, and what you want to do is you want to make sure that whatever you use to factor is exactly the same thing in both parentheses. So we know that in order to make x squared that we're going to have to use x times x. So that part is easy. Now the fraction might throw us a bit, but keeping in mind that we have to put in the same number in both positions, it's actually fairly easy. I can come down here to my work and I can see that the number that I squared to give me 25 over 4 is 5 over 2. And so I'm going to go ahead and plug that in right here, 5 over 2 and 5 over 2. It was positive when I put it in, so I'm going to use a plus here, and we could easily check that to see that that's going to work. Because as we multiply that out, we're going to get x squared plus 5/2 x plus 5/2 x. That would combine to give me 5x, and then a 25 over 4 on the end. All right, let's simplify on the right-hand side. Now, the easiest way to do that is probably just to plug that in your calculator. And so when I do that, negative 4 plus 25 over 4, that's going to give me 2.25. Written as a fraction, that's going to be 9 over 4. And it will be easier for you if you will keep these answers as fractions. All right, so now what we have, come up here, we have 2 of these x plus 5/2. So I'm going to write it x plus 5 over 2 squared. And we have it equal to 9 over 4. All right, so step 3, we factored the left-hand side. The next step is to take the square root of both sides of the equation. And that's going to allow me to get in here and solve for x. So I'm going to take the square root, and I'm going to take the square root of this side. So I know that when I take the square root of something squared, like I'm doing on the left, that square root is going to disappear. It's going to cancel with the squared and leave me just x plus 5/2. When I take the square root of 9 over 4, take the square root of the top and the square root of the bottom. So the square root of 9 is going to be 3. The square root of 4 is going to be 2. And remember that when you take the square root of a number in an equation, you have to consider the positive and the negative. And then the last step is simply to solve for x. All right, so solving for x is going to mean that I'm going to subtract 5/2 from both sides of the equation. So when I look at my solutions, I actually have two solutions here. I have a solution where x is equal to positive 3 over 2, and then I'm going to subtract the 5/2. And I have a solution where x is equal to negative 3 over 2, and I'm subtracting the 5/2. So on the first one, 3 minus 5 is negative 2, so we're going to have negative 2 over positive 2, which is going to be an answer of negative 1. On the second one, negative 3 minus 5 is going to be negative 8 over positive 2. And so our solution there is going to be negative 4. And again, we started with a very simple equation. This was actually something that we could have factored just so that we could see the steps. All right, so let's try one more example. All right, our example is 2x squared minus 3x minus 1 is equal to 0. And I wanted to show you this one because I want to remind you that when you're completing the square that you must have a 1 in front of the x squared term. So the fact that we have a 2 right here is potentially a problem. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and separate. That's my step 1. I'm going to put the x terms on the left-hand side of the equation. And I'm going to add this 1 to both sides, which will move it over to the right. Now, before I can complete the square, I have to have a 1 in front of the x squared term. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to factor that 2 to the front. I'm going to pull it outside of the parentheses so that I can work inside the parenthesis with the coefficient of 1. So if I take a 2 out of an x squared, that's just going to leave me an x squared. Okay, now here I need to take a 2 out of a negative 3. So I need to ask myself, 2 times what is going to give me negative 3? Okay, and you can do that by simply dividing both sides by 2. And you can see that that missing term will be negative 3 over 2. All right, so I already have the negative, so I'm just going to put in the 3 over 2x. And then I'm going to leave it set equal to 1. Okay, so now we are set up to complete the square. So remember that step 2 of completing the square is to take half of your middle term, so 1/2 times the middle term. The middle term is negative 3 over 2. You do want to pull that sign with it. It'll make the factoring easier at the end. Okay, so 1/2 times negative 3 over 2, and we want to square that. So when I multiply my fractions inside the parenthesis, 1 times negative 3 is negative 3, 2 times 2 is 4, and when I square it, I'm going to get a positive 9 over 16, squaring the top and squaring the bottom. And so remember that that is going to be added to both sides of the equation. So I'm going to add in 9 over 16 here. And then I have to be very cautious when I add it to the other side. Because this 9 over 16 is inside a parenthesis that is being acted on by the 2, if I simply add a 9 over 16 over here, then I'm not keeping it balanced. Okay? So what am I actually adding to the left? I'm adding 2 times 9 over 16. So 2 times 9 over 16 is going to be 18 over 16. Okay, and I can either leave it like that or I can reduce it. It doesn't really matter. I guess I can reduce it. That's going to reduce to 9 over 8. All right, so again, you want to be careful when you're adding to both sides. Take into account that that 2 is going to act on the 9 over 16. Multiply it through and then add the equivalent term on the other side. All right, so our next step is to take what is in the parentheses and factor. So I'm going to leave the 2 on the outside, and I'm going to work at factoring on the inside. Now again, the fractions make this look a little scary, but it's actually very easy because I know that x squared is going to have to be an x and an x. And then how am I going to make 9 over 16? I'm going to come back up here, and I'm going to use what I had right before I squared it. So that's a minus 3/4. And then I'm going to use my calculator, if I need it, to add these two terms together on the right-hand side, and I'm going to get 17 over 8. So now I'll put this together. I have 2 of these x minus 3/4 is equal to 17 over 8. Now my next step is to work towards solving for x. So the first thing that I need to do is I need to get rid of the 2 on the outside of the parenthesis. All right, so in order to do that, I'm going to divide both sides of the expression by 2. Okay, so the 2's are going to cancel on the left. And so that's going to leave me x minus 3/4 squared. And then I need to figure out what's going to happen on the right. So remember that we don't have a really good way to divide fractions. Instead, we do the keep, change, flip. So we keep the 17 over 8. We change the division line to a multiplication, and we flip the 2. So the reciprocal of 2 is 1/2. So I have 17, 8 times 2 is 16. So this is going to equal 17 over 16. Now, what's next? So I'm still trying to solve for x, so I'm now going to take the square root of both sides of the expression. So remember that the square root and the square will cancel each other out, so that will just leave me, actually I don't need the parenthesis anymore, so that will leave me x minus 3/4. Okay, now what happens on the right? I cannot take the square root of 17, so I'm going to leave that part underneath the square root. But I can take the square root of 16. The square root of 16 is 4. And again, remember that when you take the square root of a number in an equation, you need to have the positive and the negative. All right, still solving for x. My last step is going to be to add the 3/4 to both sides of the expression, which is going to cause it to cancel here, leaving me just an x. So I'm going to put the 3/4 first. So x is equal to positive 3/4 plus or minus the square root of 17 over 4. Now, that gives me the two solutions. I can't really do anything to simplify them, so I guess your options would be you could leave it pretty much like this, realizing that you have two answers right there. Or if you wanted to, you could break it up and you could say one of your solutions would be 3 plus the square root of 17. The denominators are the same, so I'm just going to write it over 4. And another solution would be 3 minus the square root of 17 over 4. So either way is fine there for showing your two solutions.